Ladies and gentlemen, dear friend, let me wish you a warm welcome to the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. My name is Gilles Carbonnier. I'm the editor-in-chief of our journal, International Development Policy, and professor here at the Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you for this policy debate. It's our fourth policy debate tonight on humanitarian action and protection, lessons from Sri Lanka. As you may know, these policy debates actually are first produced on paper. We have lead authors who are both academics, researchers on one hand, and on the other hand, policymakers and practitioners. And we get them to debate on a hot, important development humanitarian issue and topic. And then we put this debate online where different actors from different perspectives discuss an issue. And after that, we have blog discussions ongoing, but we invite some of these authors here in Geneva to have a live discussion where they can raise the main points that they have done and engage the audience also in a discussion. So we'll have, all in all, about half an hour for presentations and then half an hour for discussion. So tonight we have the chance to have with us two key actors who know very well the topic we are going to discuss about, humanitarian action and protection in Sri Lanka. Just to frame a bit the issue, you remember that the tremendous sea quake that we had in the Indian Ocean and the following tsunami 10 years ago hit both Sri Lanka but also the Indonesian province of Aceh. And in Aceh, it contributed to the quick resolution of the civil war and the conclusion of a peace accord a few months later. These things did not play out that way in Sri Lanka, where hostilities escalated between 2007 and 2009 and ended up with the final military defeat of the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, in May 2009. Now, according to the UN, the final stages of the civil war produced over 40,000 casualties, and just in the final year, some 280,000 people have been internally displaced and interned actually in camps, in closed camps, under military control. The specific issue is that humanitarian organizations were selectively granted selective restricted access, provided they basically conformed the wish and the will of the government, and that they sign a memorandum of understanding, taking a number of commitments, including remaining silent on a number of issues that they witnessed. And this kind of Sri Lankan model, between brackets, have been a source of questioning, but also maybe even a source of inspiration for other governments who were wondering how to manage international organization and the humanitarian sector in the midst of counterinsurgency operations. So the topic is highly relevant, and for this, with continued discussion both in Sri Lanka with regards to the investigation into alleged war crimes, but also lessons for ongoing crises now, including Syria, of course. So to launch this debate, we will first have the author of the lead paper, Norah Niland, on my right, who is research associate here with our Center on Conflict, Peacebuilding and Development, CCDP. And Norah has held many positions and had several field assignments in the humanitarian, human rights and development sectors, including, of course, Sri Lanka, but also Cambodia, Liberia, Afghanistan, and others. Then we will have Sir John Holmes, who will react. And Sir John Holmes was the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the emergency relief coordinator during the Sri Lankan crisis we will discuss about tonight. During his term as head of UN OCHA, he also had to face crises in Darfur, Gaza, the DRC, Somalia, Haiti, Afghanistan, and many other places. And presently, he's director of the Ditchley Foundation, which is a charitable foundation that convenes and organizes, hosts international conference on big international issues. Prior to that, Sir John Holmes was a British diplomat with a long station in France, I understand, as well as advisor to Prime Minister John Major and Tony Blair. Lastly, we have a third written contribution by Miriam Brade, who is assistant professor at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies, but who is not with us tonight. Let me then, before giving the floor to Norah and Niland, mention also that we have the chance to have Neil Bunet with us here. Neil Bunet is now head of UNDP in Geneva, but he was and served as the humanitarian coordinator in Sri Lanka between 2007 and 2011. So without further ado, Norah, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Good evening. It is good to be here. And thanks to the Graduate Institute and Gilles and other colleagues for organizing this. It has been a little bit of time, of course, since the war came to an end in Sri Lanka, but it is never, I hope, especially in an institution like this, too late for learning. And we know from experience that if we don't learn, we're in danger of repeating these terrible situations. I don't know how many people in the room are familiar with events that happened in Sri Lanka, and thanks, Gilles, for framing the discussion. And we only have in order to allow for discussion later, 15 minutes each, so I will keep this brief and just focus on two main themes through the course of my presentation. And the first theme is the issue of too much confusion about what protection means in the context of humanitarian work, humanitarian action in Sri Lanka. I'm going to focus on, but it's unfortunately not unique to Sri Lanka. And the other one is too little commitment, again, to addressing issues about protection in the context of humanitarian work in and outside the humanitarian arena. I can keep this quite brief on context, but just thanks to Gilles, I've already presented it. If you've ever been to Sri Lanka, you know that it is a beautiful island. And you might also know that it's a country since the creation of the state, ending of colonialism in 1948, a pretty awful history in terms of its identity politics, in terms of the way in which structural violence and the marginalization of particular groups has characterized the evolution of the state. In the mid-70s, when I actually was working in Sri Lanka, so it was before the war, I was working at the end of the 1970s, but in the mid-70s, I always mispronounce his name, Mr. Prabhakaran established the LTTE, Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, and other groups also at that time were pushing for greater independence or autonomy. And then a few years later, in 1983, that things in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, descended into war after the killing of some Sri Lankan army soldiers up in Jaffna. And that led to quite a bloodletting. And then for the next 25, 26 years, warfare, as well as attempts at peacemaking, but to little effect. Then, of course, 9/11, 2001 happened. And whereas the Tamil Tigers were already noted for their particular approach and tactics they used, the global war on terror added to the demonization of the Tigers. And shortly thereafter, in 2004, the Tigers split with the faction in the east moving over to the government. And then that was a factor in the war to regain the territory that had been under the control of the Tamil Tigers in the east between 2006 and 2007. On the humanitarian front, in 2006, as things escalated, 17 NGO colleagues were shot deliberately, were targeted and killed in their own compound. So that's 2006, 2007, in very, very brief, rapid-fire motion. And then the period we're going to be looking at this evening is the end of the war, which I'm phrasing from or timing from 2008, 2009. The war came to an end in May 2009. So I'd said a moment ago that I'm going to focus on two themes, confusion and why there is so much of it. So that I am not adding to it, let me underline that humanitarianism, from my perspective and my understanding of my work, is about life-saving. It is not about stopping war. So, of course, I totally agree with John Holmes when he says that humanitarians should not be scapegoated for the abysmal failure of all of us in terms of events that happened in Sri Lanka in 2008, 2009. So I agree that it's a responsibility with a lot of actors. And if I just take the period of the war, the 1980s, the 1990s, and up to much of the 2000s, is that what John says, until the end of 2009, clearly there's a lot of evidence that structural violence deepened. So then one has to ask, what was the human rights arena? What is the development community? What were development actors doing in terms of these very deep fault lines in Sri Lankan society? I mentioned earlier how events change, or how, not events so much changed, but how events were influenced by the emergence of the global war on terror and in 2001. And also, as the war intensified, lots of things were happening. The global war on terror agenda, the geopolitics of the region. I mean, Sri Lanka is situated in a neighborhood very close to maritime fishing lanes. But also the geopolitics includes the different agendas of changing agendas. For example, some big-time states, India, of course, the United States, and also China. But then back to humanitarians. In September 2008, when humanitarians were given basically an eviction notice from Kilinochchi, and Kilinochchi is a town where, at that time, it was, if you like, the capital of the Tamil heartland in that part of the world, in that part of Sri Lanka. So when this eviction notice was given by the authority, the Rajapaksa regime in Colombo, I think very much the writing was on the wall, both given the prior experience of the war in the East. And from my point of view, it was and is a problem that basically United Nations and the bulk of the humanitarians, with the exception of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the local branch of Caritas, left Kilinochchi without protest. In addition, there was no real preparedness plan, although it was well understood what was the nature of the war, what was the nature of a government that repeatedly talked about a pledge of 0 civilian casualties. I mean, from any perspective, I think it would be difficult to say it had any credibility in relation to that. And of course, the Tamil Tigers also were presenting their own problems. So from my perspective, this is what I write, it highlights the way in which humanitarians are often, for want of a better term, other terms I could use, confused about the way in which the system relates to issues that occurred during the time of the war. I also say in my paper that protection was deprioritized in favor of addressing material needs. So even though the humanitarian system withdrew, and within a very short period of time from Kilinochchi, it immediately engaged in negotiating access to get into what was then very much a besieged population. And in relation to this, of course, while the humanitarians were spending a huge amount of time, and not that it was not needed to negotiate access, to get material goods to people, but it tended to deflect from what were the biggest threats to life in Sri Lanka at that point in time. And for someone like me, what were the biggest threats? Was it deliberate, indiscriminate attacks on field hospitals? Was it coerced dragooning of kids to join the Tamil Tigers? Was it the way in which the suffering of the besieged population was deliberately manipulated and used to generate different narratives? And of course, the Tigers not allowing the people to escape when there were possibilities of doing that. And was it the indifference of the global community to what was happening in Sri Lanka? And of course, it is not unique, this indifference, since anybody who picks up a newspaper now and again or goes online will see what is happening in Syria. And was it the give war a chance? This was basically a consensus of key member states, the Permanent Five and the Security Council, who had come to the conclusion, there's evidence to back this up, that it was better that the Tamil Tigers were wiped out, and of course that ipso facto means being wiped out whatever cost to civilians. So of course I agree with John Holmes and Niels when they point out, as do others, that the Rajapaksa regime, which has just been pushed out in an election, I guess 2 to 3 months ago, which is a positive news, was very difficult. It was also very astute and had a long history of knowing how to manipulate humanitarian action. It used the global war on terror narrative to its advantage. But someone like me would argue that any group that slaughters without abandon the people in its own territory is vulnerable to criticism, and that has to be a plank of what humanitarians are doing when operating in these situations. I argue in my paper that the Give War a Chance agenda should have been challenged, and that even though I agree, of course, with John Holmes that there was no lack of information or understanding available about what was going on. As we see now, I mean, the Palestinian story has gone on for how many decades, and as we see in Syria. But for me, as a humanitarian, the issue is not so much, of course, I agree, the issue is not lack of information, but it's how that information is being brought to bear to make it too costly for the slaughter of civilians to continue. So actually I need to take some more. So my basic argument or my basic viewpoint, and at the time when the horror story in Sri Lanka was unfolding, I was working in Afghanistan. And of course there are two very, very different contexts, and context is super important, and I can underline, highlight that. But in Sri Lanka, we were able to convince both warring parties that on the basis of the evidence that we had, that they had to rethink their tactics. In other words, it was made too costly politically, and the two warring parties in Afghanistan, as we know, was NATO and beyond, as well as Taliban and other such groups. There are other issues that I won't go into because they're dealt with in the paper, but it's about the way in which the importance of data and the way in which advocacy should be conducted. And it also deals with the way in which the government unilaterally set up what were called no-fire zones, but these actually were locations where the displaced, besieged people were herded into and then were shelled indiscriminately. And then, again, because of time factors, I'm not going into that after the war was over, the way the survivors of the war were herded into what were effectively internment camps and the way in which the humanitarians dealt with that. So to conclude, I'm still trying to keep inside the time frame. The question I'm asking, given that this is a house of learning, is, and it's back to the issue of, what did I say? Too much confusion and too little commitment. So I think a useful question to ask is, what does protection look like at those at the receiving end of this kind of abuse, these patterns of harm? What does protection look like right now to Syrians, if one asks them? And then, so this is about how humanitarians dealt with the problems, what does protection look like to humanitarians in these kind of situations? I would imagine that, and having talked to some of the survivors when I went there in 2012, from the viewpoint of the survivors, protection was about how do they keep their families safe. They had very little choices, and they also, and it's a bigger discussion which we don't have time to go into right now, is they had this incredible, in some ways, expectation that they would be rescued, that somehow the slaughter was so terrible that the rest of the world would do something to bring it to an end. So the only point I'm making here is that the way we relate to these issues is different depending on where one is at. And my viewpoint is that it's the responsibility of all of us, and not, of course, just humanitarians, but obviously very much humanitarians, to question the kind of inhumanity that results in the kind of killings that took place in Sri Lanka at the end of the war. And then on the issue of commitment, let me just close up by saying that, whether I'm working, and I've just recently come back from South Sudan and visit to Syria, whether I'm visiting a Syria or a South Sudan or a Somalia or a Central African Republic, I can go on and on. I think those of us sitting in the room here, or wherever we are, need to be aware that these situations do not happen in a vacuum. Now is not the moment to start talking about, the arms trade, the political backers for the war, for example, in Syria. We all know who they are on both sides of that horrendous conflict. And I think we should also know that it is the indifference or it is the lack of engagement of the wider global community that is also a problem. After all, it is our tax dollars that, for example, goes into backing these different initiatives on whatever side we're taking in different wars. So my basic point and my closing point is that, in my mind, commitment is an issue for all of us. Yeah, I can say, but because of time, I want the extent to which the way humanitarians are organised to back their commitment and their responsibility to address protection. But my point here is that also it is the citizens of the world, since that's part of my analysis and argument about Sri Lanka, that I do, of course, know that when there was such a strong consensus that the war be prosecuted, and it wasn't just a consensus, there was a lot of support given to the Rajapaksa regime, both military support as well as intelligence support, and that when all of us as regular citizens of the world, if we at the same time want to be claimed that we're part of a global community that respects values of humanity and we consider ourselves civilized, that maybe we should rethink what our attitude is to these situations. See, is there anything we can do as individuals or as part of larger groups to challenge the kind of inhumanity that we are currently struggling with? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norah. May I give you the floor to you, Sergeant?
Thank you very much, Gilles, and thank you, Norah, for presenting your views so well. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to put my point of view, if you like. I think it's important in this discussion that we look forward as well as back. It's important particularly because Sri Lanka is being used as the basis for fresh looks at what humanitarians should do in situations like this. But I don't think we can draw the right lessons from it unless we analyse correctly what actually happened in those dark days of 2008 and 2009. As the chair said, I was the UN's emergency relief coordinator at the time, and I have to say that Sri Lanka was probably the most difficult of the many difficult issues I faced during that period between 2007 and 2010, and it's the one I agonised, I think I can say, most over than all the others. I visited Sri Lanka 5 times between 2007 and the end of 2009. I had very many difficult issues and discussions while I was there, and also saw many distressing sights. But I do take full responsibility for all the decisions we took at the time, and I'll try to explain why we did what we did. Now, Norah makes many good points, as you'd expect, and I don't want in any way to minimise the importance of what she was talking about the protection of civilians. But I do think she is in danger of generating a basic misunderstanding in looking at the situation in Sri Lanka at that time through an almost exclusively human rights and advocacy lens, when humanitarian action, however much it is fundamentally based on human rights principles and imperatives and has a very important advocacy element as well, also has another important component of practical action on the ground which has to be fully taken into account as well. And one of the accusations against the humanitarian community in Sri Lanka at the time was it was too obsessed with these practical issues to concentrate on the fundamental protection of civilians, which should have been at the heart of all our actions. Now, I don't accept that, because I think our main focus throughout was on how we could save the maximum number of lives, as well as helping the maximum number of people in need. Now, let's be clear, we certainly failed to prevent the loss of very many civilian lives in those appalling last few weeks in that northeastern pocket of Sri Lanka, where the Tamil Tigers and the accompanying civilians were stuck and were being destroyed. But this wasn't for lack of trying. It wasn't, I think, for lack of principles or for lack of advocacy or for failure to understand the requirements of protection of civilians. And to say, as has been claimed, that humanitarians should accept responsibility for the loss of some of those lives, rather than putting the full responsibility on those who are actually, whether from the Tamil Tigers or the government side, behaving so appallingly and with such dreadful disregard for human life is certainly, in my view, unfair. The essential point to bear in mind about the situation is that the Sri Lankan government at the time had decided, essentially in 2007-2008, to eliminate the Tamil Tigers militarily. They'd amassed the capacity to do this, and they were not going to allow anyone or anything, including civilian casualties, to get in their way. For their part, the Tamil Tigers were equally determined not to surrender, to use the Tamil civilians who were fleeing with them as they were squeezed further and further as human shields for as long as they possibly could, and to somehow to force the international community through what was happening to rescue them, even at the last minute. So the government used heavy weapons and air attacks in areas where they knew that many thousands of civilians were concentrated and were bound to be killed and injured. The LTTE, for their part, the Tamil Tigers, were recruiting everyone they could by force, including children, and shooting on those who tried to flee at the time. So both sides were behaving in the most appalling fashion. And the international community, for their part, both the east and west of it, if I can put it that way, sympathised with this objective of destroying the LTTE. But they just wanted this to happen quickly. They were concerned about civilian casualties to a greater or lesser degree, but there was never the slightest real chance that they were going to intervene militarily or indeed otherwise to save the LTTE or to stop the war. That was my political analysis of the situation at the time, and nothing I've heard since persuades me that it was wrong. So faced with that reality, what chance did the humanitarian community have of stopping the Sri Lankan war machine, or persuading the Tamil Tigers to surrender, or persuading the international community to do something more, such as, for example, invoking the responsibility to protect, to take military action? Well, I think the answer is, the uncomfortable answer is precious little. That didn't actually stop us trying, through many private conversations with the government and even secret negotiations with the Tamil Tigers at a late stage, and through use of publicity and advocacy about the horrors of what was happening, to try to prevent this. For example, I remember a piece I put in the Guardian newspaper in early April about the warning of an even worse bloodbath to come on the beaches if nothing was done. And it's not true, and I think it's rather insulting in some way to suggest that we had washed our hands of all this as too political for humanitarians to deal with, or that we were not really too bothered about the loss of lives or unaware of the high priority we should be giving to protecting the civilians caught up in the conflict. I think we were the ones who were trying harder than anyone else to save those lives, and who were more deeply affected by our failure than anyone else. That's a familiar feeling, as some of the audience will know, from other humanitarian situations or crises when the political authorities on all sides won't take their responsibilities seriously, and humanitarians have to fill in for this and somehow cope with it as best they can. But I also thought that we had another responsibility as well, namely to do our best to help the Tamil civilians who were managing to escape from the war, and those who we knew would escape at the end of the war, however many had been killed in that process. And that's why we stayed engaged with the government, despite everything and despite all the terrible things that they were perpetrating. And did all we could to convince them not only that they were acting unconscionably and unacceptably in the way they were prosecuting the war, but also that their plans for the displaced people and for the end of the war in general were not acceptable and had to be improved. And over time, I believe that we did have a real effect in this area, if not on the actual war effort, and were able to do a lot to ensure that the hundreds of thousands of Tamil civilians who did escape during or after the conflict received the aid they needed, had gradually improving conditions of freedom of movement and access, didn't have to stay in the camps longer than necessary, and were able to return home with at least a minimal package of help. I don't think it's reasonable to dismiss that as relatively unimportant, or to ridicule it, as someone quoted by Norah in her piece does, as a trivial obsession with tents and tarpaulins. Now, I don't want to say that we got everything right. With hindsight, we could and perhaps should have screamed even louder than we did about the unacceptable behaviour by both sides, despite the fog of war at the time. We could and perhaps should have put more pressure than we did, more public pressure on Western governments not to acquiesce so mildly with Sri Lankan government actions. But the point is, do I think that would have made any real difference? The answer is no, I don't. The fact is that everyone who wanted to know or needed to know about what was going on in the Vani, the region where this fighting was taking place, did know. Journalists, human rights activists, governments, the Tamil diaspora, and many others. And making more noise, in my view, would not and could not have changed that, especially when the government's allies in the Security Council were making absolutely sure that there could be no proper meeting of the Council and no proper discussion of it. The underlying point here, I think this is an important point, is that advocacy about protection of civilians is not the same thing as protection of civilians. Indeed, there's no necessary link between the two. The humanitarian community is too often guilty of over-promising and under-delivering in the protection area. Too many protection officers and not enough protection, as I often said. Because the reality is that humanitarians cannot provide physical protection against governments or non-state actors who are determined to impose their will by force. And no amount of theorising or even public denunciation changes that. Let me just take up a couple of the more specific points which have been made about what happened at the time, not to just, again, to argue that we were always right, just to give my perspective of them. First of all, the withdrawal from the occupied zone, the zone occupied by the Tamil Tigers in September 2008, after the government said that our safety could no longer be guaranteed. Were we too quick to agree? Were we too acquiescent? Not tough enough in pushing back against the government? Well, we certainly could have argued more, we could have made more public fuss, and maybe we could have stayed a few days or even weeks longer. But my point there is that the situation was deteriorating so fast that we wouldn't have been able to stay for any significant period of time in any case, and it wouldn't have made much difference. And the decision to try to run convoys to get aid into the area was not an unreasonable one and did indeed work for a while. Secondly, and those of you who read the papers will have heard a bit about this, the decision to stop giving our own casualty figures in April 2008, which has been much criticised. Let me make clear again, this is not a decision to kowtow to government wishes in order to curry favour with them, or a deliberate decision to conceal the truth we knew because we wanted to achieve something else, but because we no longer felt we could stand behind those figures with any confidence. Now, was that the right decision? That's arguable, and it's been challenged by some who worked inside the United Nations at the time, but it seemed to us the right decision at the time. Would it have made any difference if we'd gone on giving these figures? I strongly doubt it, to put it no higher. We carried on saying ever louder that unacceptably high and rising numbers of civilians were dying because of the actions of both the government and the Tamil Tigers. Moreover, some other people did go on giving figures which were carried in the international media. So again, no one was in any real doubt about what was happening, but no one was prepared to do anything about it. If we take the case of Syria today, which is an even more appalling situation than what we faced in Sri Lanka, there's never been any shortage of horrific casualty figures about civilian deaths, but that has not itself led to any effective action to protect civilians. And finally, the accusation that we were too ready to fall in with government claims about the number of civilians trapped with the Tamil Tigers, and not ready enough to challenge government plans on how to deal with those who were escaping. On that first point, we did argue the toss with the government at every turn about the numbers, and we ourselves planned for far more people at the end than the government figures suggested. But we had no definitive way of proving at the time that we were right, and the fog of war and the claim and counterclaim were particularly thick at the time. On the second point about the plans for the end of the war, we were indeed very uneasy about some of the conditions in the camps, including razor wire around them, and the military presence in them, not normally allowed in camps of this kind. But we decided to hang in there to try to improve things rather than refusing to cooperate or pulling out, and therefore leaving the Tamil citizens to the mercy of the civilians, to the mercy of the government. We set a deadline for improvements, which was in the end met, and we decided to stay engaged. Now, I think that decision was vindicated by the improvements we saw in the camps over time, and by the relatively rapid emptying of the camps at the end of the war. Again, could we have taken a different view? Could we have set tougher conditions to be met by the government, or refused to cooperate at all? Yes, we could. And there's a real debate, I think, to be had about when a humanitarian community should stay on or risk having to leave, and where the red lines should be drawn about cooperation with the government or indeed with non-state actors in these circumstances. The reality for the most part is that the temptation to stay for the humanitarians is almost always overwhelming, to stop the suffering, and that's usually the decision that's made. But the question is that right? And does that not send a message, particularly to strong and unprincipled governments like the one in Sri Lanka at the time, that humanitarians will take almost any humiliation rather than pull out? And I accept that's a real risk and that's a real debate to be had. I still believe in this case that we were right to stay and to help where we could, but again, that's something that can be discussed. Now, overall, and finally, looking forward, I fear that if we accept too readily the kind of conclusions in Norah's piece and the conclusions of a separate UN study of the events, and we put human rights and advocacy considerations above everything else in what may often be a vain attempt to stop governments and others behaving in unacceptable ways, This would often not actually help in practice those in need, and would leave the UN and the humanitarian community unable to act, even if they could better satisfy their consciences and their principles by public denunciation and plenty of advocacy and lots of principled talk of protection. My view is that the UN and the humanitarian community have to be more than just another version of Human Rights Watch, which is not a criticism of Human Rights Watch, but there's a division of roles there. So my point I would make is that what we did and what the similar things humanitarians do in similar circumstances should not be somehow seen as a grubby compromise or abandonment of principles. We never said to ourselves in Sri Lanka, let's conceal our real knowledge and spare the government criticism just in order to stay and provide physical aid. There certainly were attempts by the Sri Lankan government to intimidate us over many years, and operating in Sri Lanka certainly was a major challenge. But what we were trying to do in the very difficult political circumstances I described at the beginning was to balance the need to tell truth to power, privately and publicly, and the attempt to influence the policies of those responsible for these unacceptable acts, with the need to try to stay on the ground and to help those most in need of help. Now, whether we got that balance right in the particular circumstances is obviously for those looking at the situation dispassionately to decide for themselves, but I think the context has to be understood, and we should be careful not to impugn the motives or good faith of the humanitarians who were doing their best in that particular situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sergeant Holmes. We will open now the floor for the discussion. Norah, do you have something pressing you'd like to react on?
No, I think
okay.
the time is...
So I will take a couple of comments and questions and then come back here. And if you can just briefly introduce yourself before raising your point or your question.
Robert James Parsons, journalist for the Geneva Courier. There seems to be an elephant in the room that everyone's tiptoeing around and nobody's looking at. It is very well documented that in 2006, the United States had decided that the Tamils must be eliminated because they were occupying the area around Trincomalee, which the United States wanted, because it wants to build a base for what is one of the biggest and best deepwater harbors in the world, far more advantageous to the United States than what it has in Diego Garcia. They spent millions taking hundreds of Sri Lankans to Fort Bragg in North Carolina and elsewhere in the United States to train them to carry on the war that then was launched in 2007 at the insistence of the United States. So Sir John says that the Sri Lankan government decided to eliminate the tigers. It wasn't the Sri Lankan government, it was the United States government. It was backed by the United Kingdom, India, in varying ways and to varying extents, and particularly Israel. No one talks about that, what was going on. It was the United States and its geostrategic interests that's constantly in the background, going back even before the 1980s. And so when it comes to humanitarian aid, it seems to me the humanitarians did the best they could under the circumstances, and they were between the devil and the deep blue sea because they were up against a superpower. But to talk about the Sri Lankan government, as Sir John does, as if it were an autonomous and completely sovereign entity, I think is completely obfuscating the whole discussion. Thank you.
David Whaley. I was a resident coordinator of the UN in 4 different African countries, and I served in the office of the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka between 2002 and 2004, when there was a semblance of a peace process. I'd like to suggest that the humanitarians have huge responsibility in Sri Lanka, and not just during that closing phase of the war. I was working with the resident coordinator, not Neil, but a predecessor. It was as long ago as 2003, when a recommendation had been made that the UN should assign international independent human rights monitors to Sri Lanka. The LTT, interestingly enough, agreed to that. The person who negotiated this was Ian Martin, who is relatively well-known, former Secretary General of Amnesty International, former very senior UN official as well. The government was not at all happy and made it clear to the resident coordinator that they would not accept this arrangement. And why I'm mentioning this was I was then asked to help draft a letter to explain to Ian Martin from the resident coordinator why the resident coordinator was so militantly opposed to this proposal. And the argument was that it would make life more difficult for the developmental and humanitarian work of the UN. Well, of course, he was right. The only problem is that anybody can do development work, anybody can deliver humanitarian assistance. Nobody else can do international human rights monitoring. And had there been human rights monitors on the ground from 2003 onwards, then we might not have had the tragedy we had in the end. Let me jump to the humanitarian role post-tsunami. I was brought into Sri Lanka to advise on rendering post-tsunami relief aid conflict sensitive. After 2 months, I gave up. It was an impossible task. The obscene levels of humanitarian aid thrown at Sri Lanka after the tsunami, and I mean, I'm an Africanist, and the average African response to an African emergency is $3 per head. I'm never quite able to find the right figure for post-tsunami Sri Lanka, but it's between 700 and 7,000. I think it's actually closer to the latter. Whatever it is, from an Africanist perspective, it is obscene. It did huge damage. It destroyed local communities along the coast of Sri Lanka, and that is now being analyzed still today with tourist warnings not to visit destroyed areas. And I'm not talking about the Tamil areas, I'm talking about the coastal areas of the whole island. But secondly, it, without any slightest doubt, destroyed the peace process. A Minister of Finance, nobody else, of Sri Lanka said, you all thought that we were going to be pressured into peace. We weren't. We're rolling in money. Because humanitarian relief, financial, particularly when it took the form of debt relief from the British government, that was obviously totally fungible and was redeployed for arms purchases, massive arms purchases, and therefore funded to a great extent the war. We then had the Mutua killings. The Sri Lankan monitoring mission, the Scandinavians, came to the conclusion that only the government could have been responsible for the killing of those aid workers because the LTTE had been chased out of Mutua 48 hours before the killings took place. I have never been able to understand why the international community did not raise hell at that stage, protest. This was the first large-scale killing of humanitarian aid workers in the world, and nothing was done about it. The clearest responsibility was clear, the facts were clear. The lack of protest on that occasion, for me, without any doubt, has led to the putting of humanitarian aid workers in greater danger in many other contexts across the globe. It is relevant. We then had the Eastern campaign and conflict, where the army behaved in a way that made it perfectly possible to predict how the war would be conducted in the north, etc. It's very interesting. The previous government of Sri Lanka, which is today referred to by the new foreign minister of Sri Lanka as an abhorrent regime, and I quote his statement to the Human Rights Council 2 weeks ago, that government used to make a distinction between what it saw as being the good UN and the bad UN. The good UN was the developmentalists, the humanitarians, the capacity builders. The bad UN was the human rights. The Human Rights Council and OHCHR. One of the saddest things about the UN's internal review of the UN's behavior at the last closing phase of the events in 2009 was the fact that the High Commissioner was blasted by most of her colleagues when she wanted to make clear public statements about the human rights situation and the civilian casualties in the north, and that is very clearly reflected in that report. Since the end of the conflict, there has been a major effort to keep the human rights group at arm's length until now, and hopefully things might be changing. Fortunately, the Human Rights Council, having initially got it completely wrong in 2009, by congratulating the government on its extraordinary human rights protection stand throughout the conflict, fortunately revisited in 2012, again in 13 and 14, and there is still now underway, finally, an independent international investigation of what happened in Sri Lanka. I've spent most of my day attending a completely different event, a special session of the Human Rights Council on the Boko Haram in Nigeria. After it, I met the Deputy Perm Rep of Nigeria, and I'm delighted to say that he welcomed the intervention of the Human Rights Council and OHCHR. He told me that the government of Nigeria has invited the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism to make an early visit to ensure that his country does not follow the Sri Lankan model. That's interesting because the reports until very recently were that the Sri Lankan government had sent several military delegations to advise the government of Nigeria on how to conduct itself in its war against terrorists. So I think there is a way of stemming this tide, but only if we are courageous enough to really look at these issues and learn lessons. I have a question just to finish with, and it's linked to a survey that's just been undertaken of the needs and demands of Tamil civilians on the ground in northern Sri Lanka. Oh, and by the way, when it is claimed that one of the successes of the UN that it has managed to encourage the government, a reluctant government, to speed the return to normalcy in the north, all I can say is that 6 years later, I don't know what kind of normalcy one is talking about because there is precious little of it in that area. Anyway, one of the demands of the victims is for an acknowledgement from the international community that they did not do as much as they could have to protect civilians, accompanied by an apology. So my question is, are we now in a position to offer to those victims, survivors, the apology, which in my view, they certainly deserve?
I propose to take a third comment or question and then come back here. So I think you have to move from one side to the other. A lady okay.
Yeah, thank you. There is only one UN. UN is working on behalf of state members. My question is about the local Red Cross Society. If you can elaborate more, Red Cross Society and the regional Red Cross Society, the activities, because they receive from IFRC and from other institutions. Thank you.
I just hold this? Yeah, it works. Well, thank you. Some very interesting questions and observations. And I was asked if I wanted to comment on John's presentation, and I declined, but I will do now, given the other issues that has come onto the table, which is good. Because when I talked about confusion as to what are humanitarian responsibilities in relation to protection, having worked both as a humanitarian but also as a human rights worker, human rights person, for me there's no confusion, and I do not see, which is why I started out by saying that it is not the task of humanitarians to stop war. It is the task of humanitarians, since when I'm a humanitarian hat on, we say we are life-saving. And my argument only in my analysis, my understanding, is that the task of humanitarians is to do a good analysis that identifies what are the biggest threats to life, and then see what is their role in relationship to that. So of course, no one is pretending or assuming that humanitarians can go out and stop barrel bombs in Syria, etc., etc. But that does not then result in a conclusion that humanitarians just turn their back on it. I really do need to underline that humanitarians, but also everybody else, when there is that kind of inhumanity, wiping out so many lives, that all of us have a responsibility, and including in particular humanitarians, to challenge it. Now, how we challenge it and what is the way to do it that is effective is a big, big discussion, but there are examples out there of what can be done to, my own line is, how do you make it too costly politically? Whether it's, for example, the Taliban or NATO in Afghanistan. How do you bring sanity to bear so that the warring parties do take into account what the results of their actions are? So that was one issue. For the journalist talking about the role of the United States in Sri Lanka, yeah, in 15 minutes, and I was told I couldn't go over them, I had to keep it brief. When I talk about the consensus of, what was the wording I used? Give war a chance. This is what I'm talking about. That there was this unholy alliance within the Security Council, the Permanent Five, but also outside it, because it included India. And it wasn't just give war a chance, but also intelligence and other information was provided to the Rajapaksa regime, as well as war material. David Whaley's comments, of course, I agree with you. I don't know about after the war was over. I haven't followed it, but I don't have a problem at all with humanitarians or anybody else apologizing for our efforts, when I have my humanitarian hat on, being less than adequate. The question on ICRC, I'm not quite sure I got it fully, but yeah, ICRC during the end phase of the war in Sri Lanka can stand up. I won't say stand up and be proud, because as John said, it was a complete failure, all our efforts, but the ICRC did take a position that was better able to mitigate the effects of the war than many others.
Thank you. There's a lot of points there. Just on the first point of the US role, I mean, to be honest, I don't recognize the description you gave of what was behind all this. I mean, I have no doubt in my mind that it was the decision of the Sri Lankan government that they wanted to destroy the LTTE was at the heart of this. Now, I don't think the US had any objection to that, and they had absolutely no love for the LTTE, and they may have been interested in the Trincomalee naval base, but it never seemed to me to figure very much at the time. Actually, the main supporters of the Sri Lankans at the time were the Russians and the Chinese, not the Americans. So, I don't quite recognize your description. On the points made by David Whaley, I mean, there's quite a lot of things there, but I'm not sure all of them are completely relevant to what we're talking about here. I mean, if the resident coordinator opposed the deployment of human rights monitors in 2003, he was simply wrong, and that wasn't the case later. I mean, there was a later attempt by the Commissioner for Human Rights to have an office set up in Sri Lanka, which was certainly supported by the rest of the UN system, but was very clearly rejected by the government. I quote in my book, actually, somewhere, the comment made to me by a senior Sri Lankan official during the war that the best thing they ever did was keeping the human rights organization out of Sri Lanka, which demonstrates the depth of their cynicism in many ways. I mean, if there had been human rights monitors there, had been a human rights office there, could they have stopped what happened? I mean, it's naive to suggest that, to be honest. I mean, they might have been able to work in some way to help, but if governments are not prepared to listen to people like that, then they don't really get very far, is the truth. The aid after this tsunami, I mean, I'm sure you're right that it was excessive, certainly by comparison with many similar African situations. I mean, there's a sort of nasty truth somewhere about money raised for humanitarian crises, that the ones that are in the news most, and the tsunami was in the news most because there were Westerners on the beaches, as well as, I mean, there was a very big disaster in Aceh as well, but that's why it got so much attention, frankly, and so much money, and probably there was too much money. Was that a fundamental cause of the war? I think that's rather more doubtful. I think the government borrowed to the hilt to buy weapons in order to achieve their objective of destroying the Tamil Tigers by force. An objective which, by the way, none of us at the time, or before it started to happen, really believed was possible. But they simply did it because they had a lot of support to do it. The Mutua killings, I actually my first visit to Sri Lanka was in 2007, and it was for the first anniversary of those killings. I mean, there was quite a lot of fuss made about it at the time. I actually got myself in real trouble with the government by giving an interview to the BBC in which I said that Sri Lanka was the most dangerous place in the world for humanitarians to work at the time. And I got labelled a terrorist by or a member of the Sri Lankan government for my pains. So there was a certain amount of publicity about that and a lot of pressure for the Sri Lankan government to investigate it, which of course they never did properly. At least they did investigation, but because for reasons you can imagine, it never went anywhere. But the problem was in some ways that although I think everybody suspected very strongly exactly who was responsible, there was no proof of that. So it was difficult. I mean, it was very difficult to know who else it could have been, except some kind of government people. But we didn't have any proof of that, and it's a little bit difficult to take that forward when you don't have that kind of proof. Should we have made even more noise? I mean, there was quite a lot of noise made, but you can always say that we could have done better. The northern civilians and their needs and demands. I mean, I think we were right to press for the people to be able to go home as quickly as possible, even though what they were going home to was pretty rubbishy in most cases because there was nothing there. A lot of the property had been destroyed by the war. There were severe risks of minefields which were still there and only been half cleared and so on. And certainly the aid packages that we were able to give them were not adequate for their needs. But we still felt it was better to get them back there. That's what they wanted to do, was to go home. And there were a lot of fears at the time that the government wouldn't allow them to go home and would repopulate the north with Sinhalese civilians. That was a very strong accusation at the time, which turned out in the end not to be justified. So I think it was right to do that, to press for that. I mean, is there a case for an acknowledgement or an apology? I mean, what purpose would that serve? I mean, I believe that the humanitarian community did our best. We failed, that's certainly true, but we did our best. I mean, and to apologise, for the humanitarian community to apologise now, we could say we failed, and we have said that, but would imply that we felt that we were responsible for their deaths, the deaths that occurred and the losses, and not somebody else. I think it's important in these situations to put the responsibility squarely where it belongs, which is with the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan government for their disregard of human life. Again, I'm not quite sure what the question is about the Sri Lankan Red Cross. Neil will probably be able to answer better about the role of the Sri Lankan Red Cross. As Norah said, the ICRC themselves, which is a different setup, played a fantastic role, even though ultimately not a futile one, but not a totally successful one, at the end of the war and throughout the war. And one of the great strikes against the Sri Lankan government at the time was that they were punished for that after the end of the war by being prevented from working in the north, which was just childish and unprincipled. But I can't say anything more about the role the Sri Lankan Red Cross played. They were no doubt in an extremely difficult position, caught between the government and who were putting pressure on them to do certain things and their own desire to help.
Thank you. Because of time constraint, we will just take one or two additional comments and questions. Maybe I had seen a number of hands up before, so I wonder if who would like to take the floor? Maybe we'll give the chance to. Well, if that's not the case, we will end up in time. I'm just maybe before giving you the chance just of a concluding word, I have been quite struck by what Sir John Hughes said about the fact that the imperative to act is extremely strong within the humanitarian sector. And of course, the imperative to act is to provide assistance and try to do whatever can be done for those who need help. And indeed, it's a very strong imperative. I remember a former ICRC president saying, no, the ICRC does not assist and protect, it assists and tries to protect, to be less ambitious. But still, what we see now is a very competitive sector with current turnover of over $25 billion a year, where for many humanitarian organizations, not to be in Sri Lanka at that time, not to be in Afghanistan, Somalia, and South Sudan today, is problematic in terms of critical mass, in terms of presence, and in terms of competition within the humanitarian sector. And what I sense from some of the comments we got before is to say, why doesn't the humanitarian sector as a community does not stand firmer when, for instance, a number of community members are killed, and there are strong presumptions that we know why and by whom. Why doesn't the humanitarian sector stand firmer on critical issues such as current counter-terrorism provisions that restrict the capacity of the humanitarian sector to provide impartial assistance and protection? Why does the humanitarian sector not stand firmer on certain critical issues like today, kidnap for ransom? So my question is a bit, how much is it related to this imperative to act, but how much is it also related to discord within the sector where competition goes side by side with cooperation and sometimes hamper a more firm position of the sector where it would have more clout actually to negotiate, to engage states and actors when things are simply not acceptable. So this is maybe my question to you. Would you like to start first this time? Thank you.
Well, I think you pose a very good question. I mean, the first thing to say is the humanitarian system is not a system. It is a rather random collection, a fragmented collection of organizations which have decided for different reasons to take up humanitarian work in the world, I mean, for idealistic reasons. And of course, there are UN organizations of which there are too many with too many overlapping mandates and all the rest of it. So it is not a united system. The job I occupied for 3 or 4 years as the emergency relief coordinator is supposed to coordinate it, but I don't, I and my successor don't have any power over it. The NGOs are all independent. That's the point of being NGOs, they're independent. Even the UN agencies are not subject to instruction by the emergency relief coordinator. Still less in the ICRC or the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent Societies. So, it's not a system. And indeed, even insofar as it operates in a vaguely coordinated way, there are quite a lot of actors outside that altogether, from the Islamic world, for example, who don't play the game by the rules that we think they should play it. So the idea of having a totally united view is a bit of a pipe dream for the moment. I mean, I would hope it will become more united, but you need to be very careful, when you start to talk about that you don't destroy its value. Because the reverse of the coin of the fragmentation and the chaos, if you like, is that it's very diverse and very independent. It's not under the control of governments or the UN or anybody else, and there's a certain amount of healthy competition as well as perhaps of unhealthy competition at times. Now, if the humanitarians got together more effectively, could they have more impact? Yes, I'm sure they could. And I think that, for example, in one of the cases you cite about fighting against counter-terrorism regulations which actually restrict aid, I think they should be more vocal. And I think there's a real issue that a lot of the NGOs and maybe the UN agencies as well are a bit risk-averse and don't want to challenge the Americans, because that's the main source of this legislation. For fear of being cut off, their funding being cut off, or somehow being on the wrong side of public opinion, which doesn't like terrorism and so on. So I think there's a real issue there. Now, if we got together more effectively and stood up, as you put it, I think, to governments, would that necessarily change things? Well, it's quite hard when governments like the government of Sri Lanka or the government of Sudan, with which I had a lot of also extremely distressing experiences, because you can only be in their country at their request, or rather with their consent, I should say. And if you don't have their consent, you can't be there. If you're not there, you can't do anything. That's the reality. That's an uncomfortable reality, but that's the reality. Hence, you get this tightrope of criticizing and talking about the terrible things you're seeing, but at the same time trying to stay just on the right side of the government for fear of actually being thrown out. Now, is it being thrown out at the end of the world? No, it's not, perhaps, but it's not going to do much good for the people you're trying to help. That's the case. So take another example of, not the Sri Lankan example, but Darfur. In 2009, the Sudanese government threw out 13 NGOs from Darfur on the grounds that they have been cooperating with the rebels and were not doing anything useful anyway, and various other sort of spurious accusations. And the same question arose, well, what should we do in response? Do we all walk out in sympathy? Or do we protest and try to get the decision reversed, but also stay in there and continue to work in Darfur? And we took the second decision, and that's why I was saying earlier that that's what humanitarians will tend to do, because they do believe at the end of the day that being present is very important, and actually deterrence by presence is quite significant sometimes. So if we'd all left, who would have been most pleased about that? The Sudanese government, possibly, but certainly not the people who were trying to help in Darfur. So that's the dilemma you get yourself into when you're dependent on the government for permission to operate, and yet the government's behaving unacceptably. Now, could we be more united and more effective sometimes? Yes, I think we could. But again, let's not put all the pressure on the humanitarians. The humanitarians cannot solve the political problems of the world. They cannot. And then they should try perhaps, but they shouldn't assume that responsibility, because if they're not careful, they will then be dragged into kinds of political action which are incompatible with their mandate and imperative to operate on the basis of need, not on the basis of politics. So, it's a very long answer to a good question, but I think it's a very complicated area, which many people have looked at over time. There is a risk that if you... my fear was always that in an attempt to build a new system, you would finish up with something which was a kind of monstrous bureaucracy, with a single, UN agency or much less diversity in the system. It would actually possibly be worse even than the rather inadequate system we have now.
Thank you. Norah, you have the last words.
Actually, I don't have a lot of words because a lot has been said, and a lot of it I agreed with. But to try to step back from, what Sri Lanka tells us, what are we supposed to learn from it in relation to where the world is at, and the bulk of what's currently the organised humanitarian system is emerged after World War II. Lots of organizations existed, of course, before that. But in terms of where it's at now, we've spent a few decades tinkering with it, reforming it, quote unquote, and all the rest. And so I think, stepping back and looking at it, seeing where are we at, and where do we as individuals and as humanitarians going. So I think two things that I should say is that, on the one hand, when someone like I started out in the 1980s by accident, which is what happened then, working on the Thai-Cambodian border, and contrasted to now, I mean, one of the differences is that nowadays, and it's positive, is that average citizen or your average disaster or war-affected individual, civilian or otherwise, is more aware and more demanding that they are entitled to be treated with a certain level of respect, that the protected status of civilians, this is not human rights, this is humanitarian law, that there should be a distinction between civilians and combatants. So those who are at the receiving end of the junk that goes on, more and more of them are both more aware of that and more speaking out about it. So that's happening on one side of the story. On the other side of the story, we have a very, very big, and I don't disagree with John Holmes saying we call it a system, but actually it's lots of different parts, because a huge amount of work goes into trying to make it a system. But everyday life, whether I'm in South Sudan or Somalia or whatever, is that to a great extent, humanitarian outfits go their own way. I mean, so there is a system, and it's important that there is some kind of networking or mechanism that humanitarians can act together with some level of unity on some issues. But the way in which the system has evolved, indeed, I would say, is quite problematical. But then it's also true that in a situation like Syria, and I've not worked in Syria, but I was there recently, and of course, like everybody else, one tracks it because it's on the news, and rightly so. But there is one guy, I understand, but it's the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, based in London. He's got a very good network. So he's a very small amount of resources. But, and questions can be asked about all the data they put out. That's fine. But my only point here is that given our networked world, given the kinds of technology we have today, I actually disagree with John that one has to be present to be of help. If I go back to my Afghanistan days, a lot of the work we were able to do was also through networks. And in contrast to the 1980s, in 2008 Afghanistan, it was a teenager in Herat who sent me video footage of an airstrike that had killed, when all the counting was done, it was 92 people, but he just sent video footage of 6 tiny little babies. So the point is we are operating in a different world. And for me, the positive is that, of course, yes, there is better information. It's a negative that we're not using it. But those who are directly affected will be more, what's the word I'm looking for here? Will be more vocal and will be more determined to hold the rest of us to account when we're also part of backing, even if it's not our decision, but we're part of a international relation setup that gives rise or exacerbates or contributes to situations that existed in Sri Lanka and that now obtain and will persist for quite some time, I fear, in Syria. So my takeaway is that Yeah, good questions, but also that the world is changing fast, and I take faith and hope out of the fact that it is the war affected, it is the disaster affected, who will be holding more of us to account. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to conclude by thanking our very distinguished speakers, but also to just note a note of appreciation by the fact that doing and preparing this policy dialogue after receiving the critical piece of paper by Norah and Niland, I contacted those who were in charge within the UN, and I was very much impressed by the positive reaction and response by both Neil Bunet and then Sir John Holmes, who immediately said, yes, we want to engage, we are ready to stand for what we did, etc. And I think this is quite rejoicing, because I must admit that it's not always the case when we try to engage policymakers based on a critical piece that question actually some of their decision and their responsibility. So let me thank them very much and propose that we give them a big applause to Norah and Sir John Holmes. Thank you very much.